Hello, I'm Hannah. My short story collection, Little Birds, is available on Amazon in ebook and paperback. If you want to check it out, it pays my rent. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell because I make videos every Thursday and you don't want to miss out. Because, you know, videos vanish as soon as they're uploaded, but really it makes the algorithm like me, so if you can... Thanks. So today we're talking about something that I get questions about all the time, writing with multiple perspective characters. So perspective character is going to be the character that we see the story through. You can have one perspective character, you can have multiple perspective characters. The most typical types of perspective in novels are first person, third limited, and third omniscient, and I have a video on that if you need to go see the basics. In this video, I'm mostly going to be referring to first person and third limited. Third omniscient is a little bit more complicated and that'll have to be another video. And I mostly have full-length novels in mind with these tips, but they can be applied to other forms as well. One question I got a few times is how many perspectives is too many? As a general fact, the more perspectives you have, the more difficult it will be to write. Each character needs their own voice, not only in their dialogue, but in the entirety of the prose in that perspective. If your characters are all exactly the same, why do we need multiple perspectives? Game of Thrones is the first series that I think of whenever I think of a large cast of characters. Obviously that world is very involved, a lot went into developing it, and a lot of time and effort went into crafting each individual character. Are you ready for that kind of commitment? Think about your experience level and how much you want to be challenged and how much time you want to spend on this project. I would not reach for a huge character cast if you're a new writer. One of my writing partners has been writing for years and she's one of the best writers I know. Her novel has 5 perspective characters and she worked for a while to develop them before she could actually start writing her novel because she had to nail down the different narrative voices of each character, and she did really well. When I start reading one of her chapters, I don't even have to see a name to know which character's perspective I am. That's how strong her voices are, and that's a skill that she has developed for years. She has a degree in creative writing, she has tons of experience, but it still took her a lot of time to develop those characters to make it that quality. So keep that in mind. Even for an experienced writer, it takes a lot of work to do it well. So a perspective switch is when you swap from one character's perspective to the other. This is done intentionally if you do 3 things. 1, switch perspective scene by scene or chapter by chapter. Do not switch perspective within a single scene. 2, when you begin a scene with a new character, we need to know whose head you are in immediately. 1 or 2 sentences establishing the scene is fine, then name whose perspective we are in so that the reader is grounded as soon as possible. And 3, for that entire scene, we are in that character's perspective. That means we don't get internal thoughts from other characters, we don't know anything that our narrator doesn't know, and we do not observe things that they would not be observing. If you hop around characters' heads in a single scene, that's an unintentional perspective switch. Don't do that. Some people call this head hopping. It's a common mark of an amateur, and it really detracts from your narrative authority. As soon as I read an unintentional perspective switch, I want to stop reading. So to pull off a good perspective switch, you need to stick with that character for the whole scene until a new scene or chapter starts, and we need to know whose head we are in immediately. Anything other than that is an unintentional perspective switch. So now I have some general tips for writing a novel with multiple perspective characters. Tip 1, give a healthy chunk of the story to that perspective character. If you have very short scenes and you jump back and forth between characters a lot, that can be jarring. It does take a second for a reader to settle into a new perspective, so keep that in mind. Doing this occasionally might lead to more tension if you want your reader to be kind of like uncomfortable and confused, so this could be stylistic and intentional, but in general, give a good amount of story before you switch characters. Tip 2, each perspective needs to be completely unique from the other ones. Really put a lot of time into developing each character and each narrative voice. This is very important. You shouldn't have multiple main characters if some are going to be way more developed than others. If you have 3 characters with really strong voices and one that's kind of like not there, maybe that one's not a perspective character. You can keep that character in the story, but maybe their voice just isn't strong enough to hold their own. And tip 3, kind of going off of that, each perspective character is your main character. They each need their own arc. If you have multiple perspectives just for the sake of storytelling, that's probably lazy writing. Your main characters each need their own struggles, their own arc, and their own voice. If you only want one main character, but you absolutely need other perspectives to tell the story, some writers will switch between first and third. So their main character will be in first person, but then we can duck into third person perspectives to kind of see the story from another angle or see scenes that our first person character cannot be there for. It can be tricky, but it's a little loophole if you need it. My dad called me yesterday because he was listening to an audiobook and it was multiple character perspectives, but they were all in first person, and obviously it's like the same voice actor reading all of them. So he was very confused and wanted to ask me if that was against the rules. Tip 4, if you establish a pattern, keep it. So if you're swapping between like 2 perspective characters every other chapter, keep up with it, unless you have a reason not to. One book that I won't name because spoilers, I guess no one's reading this book, it swaps back and forth each chapter between the characters until it's just the one character for several chapters because the other one has died. In Game of Thrones, there are so many different characters and there's no pattern, it just follows wherever the story is. So there are different ways that you can layer multiple perspectives, figure out what works best for you, and then do it intentionally. Tip 5, don't be redundant. If you're rehashing the same scene from multiple character perspectives just to keep the pattern, that's not fun to read. Or if you have a ton of action happening in the plot with one character and the other one's just kind of hanging out, but you still like peek back at them every other chapter because of the pattern that you created, that's not working. Outlining helps with this a lot. If you want a pattern, if you actually list out what's happening in each chapter, you can make sure the action's spread out and that we're not just looking back at a boring character to keep up our pattern. Tip 6, don't be afraid to drop a POV character. Sometimes you'll have an idea for the perspective characters you want, and then whenever you get to outlining or get to actually writing, you see that it doesn't really fit. Maybe they seem more like a side character, or they're just not working as a POV character. If that happens, maybe you don't need that perspective. I started Teogan with 3 perspectives, and I ended up dropping one of them because being in her head was really giving a lot of the plot away that I wanted to kind of hide for later, and there wasn't really a natural way to have her not thinking about those things. And also she's a romantic interest for one of the other main characters, and I found that being in like both heads of a romantic pairing kind of makes the romantic subplot a lot less interesting. So be open to dropping a perspective if you need to. And tip 7, just to emphasize this again, when you're editing, check for unintentional perspective switches. Eventually you're going to get to a point where you can write without them and you'll be able to notice as you make the mistakes, but definitely when you're editing, check for those. If your first person or third limited POV character doesn't know something, your reader does not know it either. You can't have them look at another character and know what that character is thinking or feeling without being able to observe it. So put yourself in the place of your perspective character and go observation by observation and be like, if I was this character, would I know this? Would I be looking at this? Would I care about this enough to be like thinking about it? If no, it's probably a perspective switch. So those are my tips on writing multiple perspective characters. Hope it helps. Thanks for watching, and thank you to my patrons for sponsoring this video. One of my patrons is my pal Scoopy, and he makes reaction videos that are really funny, so you can check him out in the description. Tell him that I love him. If you would like video shoutouts and a bunch of bonus content of my stupidity like blooper reels and personal vlogs and rant videos, access to our private Discord channel, and lots of other perks, check out patreon.com/hannahlee. See you next week. Bye!